So today we're going to go over the third party and how that relates to the subjective illusion of control. And this is where the object is sort of the prop for the subject to simulate its control or power, or sort of power fantasy over its environment. And it senses this problem, right? And it assigns various objects to the problem in order to say this is, in order to sort of locate where the problem is, which means that it can use its free will to fix or cleanse that problem. For a subject to have control, it has to define its problem, what its problem is. And eventually, the subject's self-control as an object also disintegrates, where the third-party objective reality sort of takes over, and the object that is the problem, the objects that are associated with the problem, become returned to its previous place before all of this, before the subject's power fantasy. So let's say you have a huge existential problem, and it's a problem that is the cause of a lot of guilt within the entire collective subject, the collective subject. The idea that excess waste, excess corruption, exploitation of the environment causes the entire collective subject to question and criticize itself. And so it now defines an object to this problem. So what's the main problem? Carbon dioxide. Excess carbon dioxide is imbalancing the environment, and it's ruining what was precious before, and it's a substance of dirtiness, right? It's the main impurity that has to be cleansed, that the subjective superego has identified. So that's one example of how the subject has identified an object of disgust, an object of impurity, which then facilitates a narrative that allows it to control its environment, because you have to identify there is either a good substance or a bad substance, and the subject now has to cleanse that impure substance using its subjective control. That's one example. Another example would be crime, collective disorder, and what's viewed as deviancy from law and order, cheating and corruption. All of this is an object in the subjective mind. It's imagined as an object within the subjective mind that is an impurity, a substance that has to be cleansed. And again, this takes the form of sort of a bogeyman. It becomes personified within the subjective perception, in this case the collective. And so the collective hones in on its object and goes to war with it, thinking that as a means to simulate control over its objective environment. Because remember, the antithesis of this would be total surrender and acceptance of total lack of control over the objective environment, which is indifferent to the subject, right? The subjective, it's any biased individual, and also any collective cannot control its environment. It's a subject to its objective reality. And so this narrative is necessary as a way to convince the subject that it has some form of control. So what happens to these objects as examples here? These objects become a prop for the subjective's purification mechanism. And what they go through is a phase and a a sub-lifetime, or a lifetime that's incorporated within this power fantasy. And objects are being basically fed into this cycle here. And these objects go through a lifetime of their own. And what this reveals is, because of there's this impermanence, it goes through this phase and this phase and this phase. It's never a monolith. It's never a static object. This sort of reveals the subjectivity of the entire process, such that the only thing that stays constant is this, the third party, and the subject, right? So in this case, if we look at it from this angle, the object is the one that's constantly changing. The subject is the only thing that's constant in its bias, right? So in this case, it's more objective than the object, because the subject is constantly biased. The object is continually changing form. And the only other constant thing is the third party, which then has the responsibility of sort of ending this process, just bringing to a close this process here. So if we take this carbon example and we feed it into this cycle here, we start here first at the preconscious phase, where the subject is not aware. It's not even aware of this object as a danger, even as an object, let alone a danger. Right, so the subject, in this case, the collective or society, is not yet aware of the existence of this object. So there is a point where society is not even aware of carbon as even a concept. We don't know it exists. And it's not even in any position to do harm. Then the circumstances change. Right? We have various things that align to create a situation where carbon is discovered, it's defined, and its usage, the various good things about it are discovered, and it becomes the center of attention. The subject now hones into the object, and clearly defines it. It pays a lot of attention to it. So the object here, it becomes defined as distinct from the rest of its environment. So we've now we've now subjectively honed out or defined, this is the object and this is what it's not. The object has now become distinct from the rest of objective reality. And along with that, because the subject has now found use for it, various good things about the object, it's also going to have an equal and opposite corruption about it. There's going to be bad things that come from this object. It's going to draw attention from both the positive and the negative forces. And then the subject starts making various associations to this object. Right? This neutral object that before wasn't even aware of its existence. Its existence what hasn't even been defined now becomes associated with various bad things. Either bad things or good things, and so it takes on a larger than life, or a bigger than the sum of its parts form. So it now as an object is bigger than the sum of its parts as it is seen by the subject. Its form has now taken on an unprecedented level of importance. So it's now of elevated importance. And because of this importance, this is going to draw various purification mechanism of the subject. Something that's important becomes associated with subjective control. And so this becomes the backdrop for the subject to simulate its power fantasy, right? Various ideological forces are going to come up with beliefs about this object here, this neutral object, that before was not even in the subject's field of awareness, but now it's going to receive special attention from the subject. And forces within the collective are going to argue and use it as a platform to debate and create conflict. And then eventually this conflict here is going to hit a point where it's no longer really feasible due to objective third-party forces, which is neither the subject or the object of disgust, or worship, right? This object here, the subject either worships this object or treats it as an object of disgust. But then, whatever is outside of the subject's realm of control, also known as objective reality, brings this conflict to a close against the subject's will. So the subject believes that this object makes or breaks its own existence. The subject believes that the object is the problem itself, and that the elimination of this object here solves the subject's problem. But then the third party is introduced, and the illusion that the subject controls its environment is sort of exposed, because you don't really solve any problem by going against any object. All purification mechanisms are imaginary. What the subject is actually beholden to all along is the third-party objective reality, which is neither the subject or the object in this case. So the third party is introduced, and it ends the conflict against the free will of the subject. The forces that either worship or are disgusted by this object here, the third party actually disrupts their free will because their attention is completely focused on this object. So what the third party does is that it breaks the illusion of the subject's control, and it breaks this conflict right here. And so it breaks the free will of anyone fighting in this domain right here. And so it ends the conflict against the will of the subject. So the subject becomes so involved and tunnel visioned with this object here, associating this object and sort of mystifying it to a degree that makes it actually something that's bigger and more significant than what it is as just a neutral object. So in the end, the subject thinks that it's solving a problem by manipulating this object right here, but it's actually the third-party objective reality, showing that this problem here actually does not actually exist. These forces deconstruct and physically break the imagination that there is a problem here in the first place, right? And ironically, the problem as an object itself only gets solved once it disappears itself, right? But all of these here, this phase here, is all about preserving the problem as it is so that the forces can fight over it, right? So there has to be another force that goes against the free will of the parties here. And ironically, only when the concept of a problem breaks, then the problem is actually resolved. That's how the subject's illusion of free will, the illusion of control here, is both a vital phase in the solving of a problem, but it also at the same time has nothing to do with the problem itself. It has nothing to do with the resolution of the problem. So what happens is the subject, being convinced that this object here, the neutral object, is actual impurity or purity, then it takes action on behalf of this object, which then changes the objective environment. So in the process of worshiping or being disgusted with this object here, the subject in its free will actually unintentionally changes objective reality from beyond its free will. But it does so, it changes it in a way that the subject does not intend or couldn't have imagined. So this subject here, contrary to what it believes, it doesn't actually control or possess either the problem or the solution. But what this imagined object does, the object of fixation here, is that it plays a role in unwittingly changing the objective environment. This subjective process here changes its antithesis or remakes its antithesis in its own way, in its own subjective way. So, in a way, the problem, the quote-unquote problem that the subject has, resolves itself eventually, but not through this object here, because it's actually the third party or objective reality that solves it. The problem is solved in this domain here, and not within this realm, the subject or the object. Right, so you got the subject here and the object in this subjective realm versus here, everything that this is not. This illusion that the subject is solving a problem here, this can only be broken by this counter right here, right? This deadlock between the problem and the solution. The only thing that's going to break that is whatever is not the subject's free will. And so during all of this, the object here plays the role of being the good or the bad, right? The pure or the impure, the object of worship or the object of disgust. This is how the object sort of reconciles both its significance and its insignificance to the subject, right? It starts off as insignificant, then it becomes extremely important, then it returns to its prior position, even though this position is entirely different than the preconscious phase. Even though its location is the same, it returns to the same location. But the subject has now integrated and learned about this object in a way that its perception or its relationship to the object is changed completely. Right? So the object here goes from being to unbeing. And so why is this significance, this impermanence here? Why split this up into three phases? Well, the nature of ideology is that it's going to try to assign a permanence to this, to this object, a permanent value to this object. So for example, if you consider pro-fossil fuel or anti-fossil fuel forces, ideological forces, so the subject considers any of these objects, in this case fossil fuels, to be either dirty or good, right? Pure or impure. And the ideological forces are going to try to assign a permanence to this object. So this object right here, that's constantly changing. Because what is subjective perception? It's limited to one moment in time. But ideology is going to try to make this permanent. And the subject is going to try to possess the object by knowing it and convincing itself that it knows this object, when it can only perceive this object at one moment in time.